Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. Thank you so much for joining us for the very first online session of the very first day of Tata Literature Live 2023, where we celebrate the power of words. So here's how the 14th edition of the annual Mumbai International Literature Festival is going to work this year. Very similar to last year, this year your beloved LitFest takes on a combined format, both online and in person. We have 2 days of the online festival, today and tomorrow, streaming across all social media platforms. And then for those in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for the physical version of the festival opening on ground at the NCPA complex on Friday and then again on Saturday and Sunday, and also at the St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and the bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra on Saturday and Sunday. You can check out the entire schedule and the list of speakers on tatalitlive.in. So, looking forward to seeing you all both online and in person so that we can celebrate the power of words together. After all, didn't Aristophanes say, "By words the mind is winged"? Now, on to our inaugural online session of the festival, Empires of the Imagination, a novel look at history, presented by Godrej. Bono wrote this year in Time magazine a quote apt for the times that we are living in. "Terrorism wants to own and inhabit you, to hijack your day and haunt your night. Salman Rushdie has refused to be terrorized. Outside of his writing, this is the lesson of his life." End quote. That's why it gives me great pleasure to inaugurate the online version of the festival this year with Salman Rushdie. Over the past 40 years, he has published 5 works of non-fiction and 16 works of fiction, including his magnum opus, Midnight's Children, which has won him 3 Booker Awards, including 2 Best of the Booker prizes. And this year, he is the winner of the Peace Prize of the German book trade. In conversation with him today is a versatile Indian poet, novelist, and dancer, whose evocative poetry and captivating prose reflect a deep understanding of the intricacies of life, love, and identity. Tishani Doshi. Mr. Rushdie is joining us from America, while Tishani joins us from Abu Dhabi. That's why this is truly Mumbai's International Literary Festival, presenting Empires of the Imagination. This session is presented by Godrej. Over to you, Tishani.
So, where do we begin? I read Victory City at the beginning of this year, and so it's been a few months. And I remember feeling this real thrill that you had decided to return to India with this book, and not just India, but to South India, to which I'm biased. But I was also thinking in terms of tone, because the previous books had looked at sort of the Trump presidency, and they seemed very much in the now. This had this sort of mythic frame. And in a way, of course, there are so many issues which we'll get into where it is speaking to things that are happening right now. But it also seems to be above time in a way. So it just sort of floats above, and it's containing all this time. So I wanted to maybe begin with you talking about this, whether it was a decision to go into a different kind of storytelling or returning to a kind of storytelling in its scope. It felt...
Yeah. I mean, as you say, I had spent a number of years before this book trying to, in different ways, trying to make sense of America, with 3 different novels, all of which are very different from each other. I mean, 2 years, 8 months, etc., has like jinns and fairies, and the Golden House is more or less realistic, and then Quichotte is a kind of melange of every conceivable literary style. But they're all trying to get to grips with, as you say, with the present moment, and not entirely in the United States, but primarily. And I just had enough of America. I just thought that's enough America, at least for a while. And then I just remembered that, in a way, the germ of this novel has been sitting in my head for a really long time. I mean, when I visited Hampi, I had not even published a novel. I was in the mid-70s. I mean, my first novel came out in 1975, and this was before that. And I was very struck by it, and I was also very struck by my ignorance of it. Why don't I know anything about this? And so I, over the years, tried to rectify that. Tried to find out more about Vijayanagar. And really, when I wrote The Enchantress of Florence, which is now already, 16 years ago, something like that, which is a lot of which is about the Mughal Empire, that also reminded me of about the South, and how much interesting stuff there was happening there. And again, I told myself, I have to at some point pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And then this moment when I was kind of sick of writing about America, I thought, let me go back there, because that seemed like a more enjoyable thing to do for me. And it was actually, I think you might be able to tell, it was quite an enjoyable book to write.
It was a very enjoyable book to read. And even though there's a lot of tragic sort of, I think, that part that I was talking about where, you have basically a realization that even though you could create an entire country or civilization from scratch, and in those seeds of creation, you have equality and secularism and all these wonderful ideals that, that the state or the nation will perhaps not live up to these ideals. And that is the function of time and history. And so, hidden message, where are we now? I think there's no way of not reading that as you read the book.
I think one of the things about a novel that deals with the past is that it does end up dealing with the present, because the way we look at the past is through our present day concerns. So when we look at the past, we see there things that chime with what we're thinking about now. So it inevitably, the past becomes a way of talking about the present, to some degree. But what I like it that you talked about timelessness, because the real feeling that I had, one of the reasons why in the novel I used the Portuguese name of Bisnaga rather than Vijayanagar, is because I wanted to say, in some way, yes, it's a historical novel, but it's also not a historical novel. It's also my imagined space. It's like my trying to imagine a world. And one of the great pleasures of fiction is world building. You create a world for the reader to inhabit. And while they inhabit that world and hopefully are enjoying being in it, doesn't matter what period it is. It doesn't matter whether it's 700 years ago or the day before yesterday. You're trying to create just a place which is on its own terms. And I thought in the end that was what I was trying to do. So it's not exactly a historical novel. It's not exactly a contemporary novel. It is this imaginary space in which one can talk about many things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should talk about the character that drives the novel, Pampa Campana. And I don't know, have you seen the new Barbie movie?
I have seen the new Barbie movie.
Okay, so the tag, she is everything, he's just Ken. I think that there's a feeling that Pampa is everything in this novel, and the men and all the characters in a way, sort of, she is the driving force. And I was so curious about how this character came to you and how this story came through her.
it's a mystery. She just showed up. I was thinking about a number of more or less technical problems about how to write the book. I was thinking, how do you write a novel that lasts for 250 years? If you don't want the novel to be 2,000 pages long, and also looking at the actual history of the period, it does seem as if Vijayanagar comes from nowhere. Like if you look like 10 years earlier, it's not there. And there are various other kingdoms going along perfectly nicely. And then almost overnight, boom, there's this thing that emerges and takes over everything. And I thought, how does an empire come into being like overnight? And she arrived in my head and said, the answer is me. and just follow along with my story and it'll make sense of all the other stuff. And the actual opening scene, this moment of Sati at the end of a military defeat, is based on a historical episode. Something not exactly the way I've described it, but something of that nature did occur at that time. And I thought, well, here's this little girl watching it, and obviously her mother is one of the people who die, and she's deeply traumatized by it. And that became the engine of the book. That became that there's the starting point, and what are the consequences of that? And then it's a mixture of historical discovery and invention. And one of the things I've said to people, which I think is true, is that everything people think I made up is true. And everything people think is true, I made up. So, for example, it's true that Hakka and Bukka Sangama announced that they were descended from the moon. And I thought, if you could say that, I could say anything. And of course, what they mean is that they want to ally themselves to this idea of the lunar dynasty, which includes Krishna and it includes Arjuna and the various colossal figures. They want to say they're in that line of descent, so they're mythologizing themselves. And my idea is if this kingdom begins with self-mythologization, that's a very useful starting point for a novelist, because it allows me to make them up too. Yeah. So in some way, I was given just the gift of Pampa Kampana, who just arrived to solve certain problems and then became, as you say, just the dominant figure in the book. And sometimes it arose from the kind of gift you get by reading history. Sometimes it gives you things you can't make up. It would have never occurred to me to make them descend from the moon. Except they did it themselves.
Yeah, I think you're one of those rare people who sort of used sort of a lot of what you studied in Cambridge, for instance, in your real life as a writer. You studied the history of Islam, you studied American history, you studied, Indian sort of mutiny to independence. I remember, hearing this somewhere that these were your topics in Cambridge. Yes. Mm-hmm. And basically, you've written about all this and more. So what is left that you haven't, which bits of history are still left for you to cover?
Well, one of the things I really hadn't written about in any great depth was South India, and over the years, my family's from the north, and I grew up in Bombay and Delhi, and my family's from Kashmir before that, and so my knowledge of the South was not great, but over the years it's improved, I don't speak the languages of the South, I don't speak Telugu and Kannada and so on, and of course in the history of Vijayanagar there is a real wealth of poetry and literature written in Telugu and Kannada and Sanskrit. So that, I have only been able to experience through translation. Unfortunately, there are beginning to be more and more translations. So I gradually got to know it better, and I've been there now many more times than earlier in my writing life. So I felt able to write about it, in a way that perhaps I had not felt confident to do earlier, because I didn't feel that I knew it well enough. And then, Vijayanagar is interesting because in some ways it's very documented. There are particularly these two Portuguese travelers, who both wrote. They didn't write exactly history books, but they wrote like social history. They talk about everyday life, and of course for a novelist, everyday life is what you want. What's in the bazaar? What kind of vehicles do people ride around in? Are there bandits on the roads? Etc. And so there's quite a lot of that. The historical record is a very interesting mixture. In some places it's quite detailed, and in other places there are kind of holes in it. And there's sometimes stuff which claims to be history which feels more like legend. And I thought, well, that's all very helpful because that gives me space to imagine myself into it. But yeah, South India was definitely a gap. I don't know what's left. I mean, maybe I have to set a novel on the moon.
Yeah. That's the next project. I was listening to your Desert Island discs this morning, which is available on Spotify. It's
Long time ago.
September 1988.
Yep.
And it's really wonderful to listen to, and I encourage people to go out and listen to it. But your first song that you offer is Mera Juta Hai Japani.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about why that song is almost your theme song in a way because of its mixed elements, its hybridity, a bit of this and a bit of that. And you have wonderful selections, other selections. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, how different art forms, because I also found out that your first album that you bought was Elvis Presley's, which one is it?
It was Heartbreak Hotel. It was a single.
Heartbreak Hotel. There you go. Yeah. So, and as someone who's read your work, you see French New Wave, you're writing about Amrita Shergill, you're painters, movies, music, all of this is coming into your work. And I just wonder, what does it mean? How does the creative process work for you with having on one hand history and research and all of this, and on the other side, all these artistic forms that you've obviously been touched by?
I mean, I just, there's a lot of nonsense in my head, and this is how it comes out. I mean, I can't even tell you theoretically how I do it. It's just that all these have been, movies, music, as well as the literary traditions, both of India and of the West, have all been very important to me. And at different moments in my working life and different books, different things rise to the surface. I mean, strangely, the one setting which I've used very sparingly is England. Where actually I've lived a very long time. I mean, not in the last 20 years, but before that. And actually, the one novel that really talks about England is the Satanic Verses, which I think about. Nobody else thinks about it as a London novel, but I think of it as primarily a novel about London in the 1980s. But the 1980s are a long time ago. So maybe, in answer to your earlier question, maybe I have to write another London novel. But I don't know. I have no idea. I just think it's great for a writer if you have the inclination to sort of dive as deeply as possible into everything that there is. Into I can't remember. There's a line of Saul Bellows which I can't remember exactly, but he says something about how you have to plunge your arms as deeply as possible into the world. and just bring up big armfuls of it, you know. And I mean, that's not what he said, but that's my paraphrase of what he said. And I think that's what I've always thought, you know. I mean, I think my view is that there's two ways of writing really well. And one is minimalism. One is to take a very beautiful, thin strand of life, you know, like one hair from the head of the goddess, you know, and like turn it in the light, you know, and that gives you your book. And that can be very beautiful. And the other is, I mean, I tend to call my books everything books because they try and do that. They try and put as much of human life as I can get into the book onto the page, you know. And I think at both those extremes, you can find really interesting work. In the middle, I'm not so sure.
Do you think you'd ever write one of those thin?
I always want. I have a desire to do so.
Okay.
You know?
And then it gets.
But it never comes out that way.
Yeah, yeah.
No,
I wanted to ask you about literary friendships, and I think, you know, both you and I work with students, with young people, trying to imagine themselves as writers, and how do you become a writer, and you kind of grow into becoming a writer. And I know that there are people who've had people that they've grown up with becoming writers and had these long friendships. And I know you've had that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those literary friendships have meant, you know, whether it's with Martin Amis or Hitchens or Kazuo Ishiguro. I mean, you've also lost, you've also
a lot of people
broken up with people over certain issues. Yeah. So yeah, how does that play in your life?
You know, you're right that there's a lot of loss, and that's just the problem of being 76. You know, people start leaving. I mean, in India, two of my closest friendships were one was Arun Kolatkar, and the other was the artist Bhupen Kakar, and also Vivan Sundaram. You know, and we've lost all of them. You know, it was because of Vivan that I was drawn towards Amrita Shergill, who's his aunt. And Amrita Shergill led me towards the character of Aurora, which became the central character of The Moor's Last Sigh. You know, so in some ways, these friendships have been very inspirational. You know, I mean, I remember when I met Bhupen in the early 80s, he said to me that my writing reminded him of his pictures. And I said, I think exactly the same thing. I think that your pictures remind me of my writing. And one of the great moments I've had is walking around the back streets of Baroda with Bhupen, with him pointing out the places that he'd painted, you know, Ajanta Watch Repair Company, etc. So I've had these very important friendships, you know, in India as well as in England and America. And yeah, a lot of them are gone. Martin is, you know, the most recent departure. And before that, you know, Angela Carter, Raymond Carver, Bruce Chatwin, you know, lots of people. I don't know how useful they've been to me as writers, but you can't be friends with a writer if you don't enjoy their work. You know, it's just not possible. So it's also to do with writers. These friendships are also to do with admiration. You know, they're to do with artistic respect.
Yeah.
And the books are still here, fortunately.
Yeah. I was thinking about the fact that you've now published 21 books.
Yeah.
And this is a truly astonishing career and a huge. I mean, your books are varied, and yet your voice is you. I wonder if you look back, because I'm sure that you are we look forwards and backwards at the same time. What is the trajectory you see of your books? Do you see yourself changing, or your voice?
Yes. Yes, a lot. Yeah. I mean, look, if I look at Midnight's Children now, I know that I couldn't write it now, but I also know that because I've just changed too much, and I also know that person couldn't write Victory City. So your life is this kind of journey. I mean, for a start, when I was writing Midnight's Children, one of the things I was trying to do a number of impossible things. The first was to tell the entire history of India in one book. Stupid, impossible task. The second was to do something to the language. To do something, let's say, Indianizing to the language, which is not just, street slang, but it just something deeper than that. And also this idea that the most central and obvious fact of India is the crowd. If you wanted a single image of India, you would talk about multiplicity, the enormous number of people. And how do you write a crowd? And I mean, those were the questions I was asking myself when I was writing Midnight's Children. Then at a certain point, you think, okay, I've dealt with that. I don't need to do that again and again and again. So what next? And the question I always ask myself is, what next? What is there that is not just a repetition of what I've done? But I like to feel that when I finish a book, I know something that I didn't know when I started the book. So it becomes like a learning process, not just facts, but even artistically, that I know something that I didn't know at the beginning. So it feels always like a kind of like a voyage of discovery, and the language thing, for example, I think I did that. And then the way in which I use language now is different, and I think is really determined by the subject matter. So a book like The Golden House, the language is quite matter of fact, and in some books, the language is more ornate, but that because of the subject matter. I mean, Victory City, I set myself this another impossible task, which is to pretend that there's this vanished epic, which is equal to the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. That's all. And that what it does is what neither the Mahabharata nor the Ramayana do, which is to put a woman's voice at the center of the story. As if Valmiki, Vyasa, as if there was a female third person, And I thought, well, that's about as cheeky as you could get. and kind of impossible. And to make it possible, I had to invent the second narrator who's retelling the story of this lost myth, this lost epic, but retelling it in more ordinary language. So it's a kind of way of being modest and grand at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you are a great fan of the frame narrative, which of course the myths have. So I think that whole idea of containing the story within story within story, it's handy to use that structure that the Ramayana allows.
Yeah. I mean, all the Indian classics use stories within stories. I mean, the Panchtantra is absolutely full of it. It's on every second page of the Panchtantra, one of the jackals tells another jackal, "Let me tell you a story." and sometimes in that story, somebody tells a story.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it comes naturally, I think, once you've absorbed those classics.
I wanted to come back to this idea of the female-centric, putting a woman's voice at the center of it. And I think in a lot of your books, there's a lot of feisty female characters. And I know that your family itself, it's filled with women more than men. So clearly that has sort of trickled down in some way.
I think having three sisters is the secret of it, really.
Yeah. So is it, Naipaul famously said that he could tell a woman writer from the first paragraph or something. Is it, I mean, is it different for you to do that, or is it more this is what the story demands and this is a
I think
character?
I think it's what the story demands. And of course, Naipaul's remarks about women writers were kind of idiotic.
Yeah, very.
I think he said, when he was asked why, he said he didn't think there was a single woman writer in history who was his equal. Not one, and and when he was asked why that should be so, he said, because they are not masters in their own home. Somebody should have smacked him. Fortunately, I don't think like that.
Who are the writers? I think Norman Mailer, did he call them lady writers? Even
well, that's it. These are two of the most masculine writers ever, Naipaul and Mailer. I mean, I was talking yesterday about Mrs. Dalloway, and I think for me that's the great Virginia Woolf novel. I know that people have claims to the Lighthouse and etc. But I think Mrs. Dalloway is kind of almost a perfect book, and in its perfection comparable to something like The Great Gatsby, because at the level of the sentence it's so beautiful, so yeah, Woolf. I admire George Eliot without loving George Eliot because she has no sense of humor.
Yes.
But other than lacking the sense of humor, she's a really colossal writer. I must say, one of my discoveries, which is relatively recent, is Elena Ferrante. Who I came to kind of a little bit later than the whole phenomenon of her. And actually, when it was kind of leaked who she was, I began to admire her more because it was clear. The books are written as if they're very, very autobiographical. I mean, the characters even have her names and so on. When you discover that she's actually this kind of haute bourgeoise lady, not even living in Naples but living in Milan, and you begin to admire the books more because of their colossal act of imagination. And so, yeah, that quartet of hers, I really admire that. Elsa Morante, talking of Italian writers, I mean, her novel, which is called History a Novel, is something I go back to, and et cetera, et cetera.
Can I ask? I think they probably have a few questions that they've been, compiled. But can I ask? Are you writing? Are you working on something at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to write a book about the thing that happened.
Yeah. Okay. And
I just think that until I've dealt with that, I can't do anything else. So I mean, it won't be a long book, shortish book. For me, I mean, I'll be under 200 pages, put it that way.
You never know, Salman. You might think that you're starting this thin strand of a goddess's hair book, and then
turns into 500 pages. Well, stay tuned. I'll let you know.
Okay, well, that's very good to hear. All right, let me pick some of these questions which have come to us. What have been the often asked questions by your non-Indian audiences?
Well, how much of it is true? That's I think we live in a moment, where truth has become problematic, for all sorts of reasons, because the world is so full of lies. And so readers really want to reassure themselves that what they're reading is either true or deliberately not true. And so I get a lot of kind of what is true and what isn't true. And I say, it's a work of fiction. It says it on the title page. It says a novel. That means don't believe anything. Except don't believe anything except it's all true. I mean, that paradox, I do think that all good literature in whatever form, whether it's naturalistic or fabulist or whatever form, is about trying to approach the truth. It's about to say something truthful about us, about human nature, about who we are, and why do we do the things we do, and how do we do these things to each other, and asking those are that's the kind of truth that the novel has always dealt with. And if it doesn't deal with that, it's no good. So in that sense, it's all true, I hope.
Yeah. There's a question about, historical fiction, mythical fiction, and whether you think, would you like to categorize your book into any kind of genre?
No, I don't really think in genres. I just think the book has to be, if the book is any good, it has to establish itself on its own terms. Let's say when you read it, you don't ask yourself, what kind of book am I reading? You simply read the book you're reading because it captures you. And I mean, the art of the novel is to engross the reader. And if the reader is deeply engrossed in what they're reading, then don't ask themselves questions about genre. They just read the book. And I don't ask myself genre questions. I mean, I don't. I've written books which could be called science fiction, but I don't think of them as science fiction. I just think of them as the very first one.
I think genre is becoming so out of fashion. It's becoming so, I don't think writers like to feel boxed in by, you're this type of writer or that type of writer, or it's fiction. Or,
I mean, there are specific writers who do write in genres, who write thrillers, who write murder mysteries, or whatever, who write narrowly defined science fiction, about science, but other than that, I think everybody that I know feels free to use whatever tools come to hand, to tell the story you want to tell. And I say my view, I don't think you could put all my books in the same bag. They change, and depending on the story that I have to tell. I mean, when I wrote Shalimar the Clown, the force of this image of this murder with which the book begins was such that I thought I have to be true to that, and that means you can't really suddenly turn it into a fairy tale. It has to be very strongly real. And so that book wanted to be that. The Enchantress of Florence wanted to be very ornate because both the literature of India and Italy at that time was like that. I thought I want to write the kind of book that the people in the book would have liked to read.
Yeah. There's a question here also about magic realism. And I was listening to Neil Gaiman talking about your book, and he sort of said, this is not that. This is mythic. This is something else. And the question is, what explains the power and relevance of magical realism today?
I think the problem with I think there's two problems with the phrase. One problem is that I think it belongs to South America.
Yeah.
I think that group of writers, Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, et cetera, it belongs to them. And it was a project that they thought they were on collectively, in the way that the surrealists were a group, who looked at each other's work and were inspired by each other. I think the real problem with the phrase is when people use it, they hear magic and they don't hear realism. And for me, everything I do, I think, has roots in the real. Whatever flower may grow out of those roots is another matter. But if the roots are not in the real, then it's not about anything. So I think realism to me is not a question of technique; it's a question of intention. If what you're trying to do is write about something true, something real, it's a kind of realism. So I mean, there's, as I say, the soil, the rich soil from which literature grows, is the real. But all of us grow different fruit, from that soil.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask one question, one last one, since we're running out of time. I heard something funny yesterday. Maybe you've heard this before, but apparently this is attributed to Somerset Maugham, who said, there are 3 secrets to writing a novel, and no one knows any of them. And I was just wondering whether, advice to aspiring writers, to young people who want to write, who still like books. Thank you for reading them. What do you have to say to them?
You reminded me of the ending of Tom Stoppard's play Travesties, which is about James Joyce and Tristan Tzara and the artists of that moment, And the narrator, the central character, says that as he's gone through his life, he's learned 3 things. He said the first thing is that if you can't be a revolutionary, you might as well be an artist. And the second thing is that if you can't be an artist, you might as well be a revolutionary. And then he pauses and he says, I forget the third thing.
Those are the choices.
Those are the choices.
Yeah. Okay. Those are the choices. All right. I think we can end on that. Yeah, why not?
Let Tom Stoppard have the last word.
Thank you, Salman, and can't wait to read the new work and to see you IRL somewhere.
I hope so. Well, I'm over here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rushdie and Ms. Doshi, for that amazingly insightful and thought-provoking conversation. And a huge thanks to you, our incredible audience, for joining us today online. Our next session online today at 7 p.m. across all social media platforms is A Walk Around the World. How did Chinese food become so popular? Chuck Kwan in conversation with Antoine Lewis. Remember also to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the entire list of schedule and speakers, because we have so many more exciting sessions lined up for you online, both today and tomorrow. And for those of you in and around Mumbai, remember, you can join us for our exciting lineup at the festival starting on Friday, October 27th through to Sunday, October 29th at the NCPA and at St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves Bookstore, featuring authors and poets such as Mamang Dai, Peter Frankopan, C.S. Lakshmi, Shashi Tharoor, Sanjoy Hazarika, among so many other fantastic writers, journalists, poets, and ideologues. Tata Literature Live would not have been possible without our title sponsor Tata, our association with the NCPA, and our co-sponsors Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session was presented by Godrej. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks. That concludes our first session for today, but remember to continue logging on to Tata Literature Live, where you can enjoy the power of the word. Happy reading.